By 1943, most American families weren't shopping with cash first. They were shopping with a ration book. USDA cost of living surveys from those years show meat, sugar, butter, and canned goods were all rationed by a point system. And a woman could have money folded in her purse and still walk out of the grocery with nothing to put on the table that night. Extension Service home economics bulletins leaned hard into organ meats, dried milk, and garden vegetables during those years, arguing a family could hold its protein and its calcium steady without spending a single ration point on any of it. Federal Writers Project interviews and wartime USDA pamphlets describe kitchens where a heel of stale bread never went in the trash and a soup bone got boiled a second and third time before anyone let it leave the pot. Number 11 on this list sent housewives hauling mason jars across town to a government-run cannery because the aluminum in a home pressure canner had been claimed as war material, and canning vegetables without one carried a real risk of botulism. Number 4 wasn't rationed at all, and it got sold over the counter in a California fish market and photographed for Life magazine. Because when beef ran short, the ocean didn't. If you've ever stretched a paycheck to the last day of the month, or cooked for one and hated wasting half of what you bought, or gone looking for a grandmother's recipe with no name and no measurements, this list is for you. These women weren't cooking for a food trend. They were cooking because the war made the decision for them. Subscribe if you want the next list before it goes up. This channel exists so the recipes that got skipped by every cookbook still get remembered by somebody. Let's start at 19. Number 19 is Prune whip ration dessert, and it solved a problem nobody talks about anymore. How do you end a wartime dinner suite when sugar is rationed down to about half a pound a week per person? The answer sat in the pantry the whole time. Prunes were cheap, plentiful, and never touched the ration point system because they carried their own sugar inside them. The method took one pot and one bowl, stewed prunes mashed into pulp, folded into stiffly beaten egg whites or a spoonful of gelatin when eggs were scarce, no oven required. A pound of prunes ran a few cents and stretched across a family of 5 for 2 or 3 desserts, which mattered when butter and sugar were the 2 ingredients a housewife guarded like currency. The gap it filled was specific, dessert without spending a single ration point on it. The texture did the selling. Pale pink, airy, faintly tart, nothing like the syrupy prune dishes of peacetime. Women who grew up during the Depression already knew prunes as a cheap standby, so the wartime version wasn't new to them, just necessary again. Home economics teachers demonstrated it in county extension classes as proof that doing without didn't have to mean doing without dessert entirely. It never came back after 1945. And nobody missed it. That's usually a sign it did exactly what it was built to do and nothing more. Number 18 is Victory Garden Squash Casserole. And it existed because by 1944, there were an estimated 20 million Victory Gardens in the United States, producing close to 40% of the vegetables Americans ate that year. That much squash coming out of a backyard plot at once created its own problem. Too much of one vegetable, all ripening the same week, with no way to can it fast enough. The casserole was the answer. Sliced summer squash layered with whatever was on hand, a little onion, breadcrumbs saved from the week, a spoonful of margarine, sometimes grated cheese if the ration points allowed it, baked in one dish until soft. It cost almost nothing beyond what was already growing, which was the entire point of the Victory Garden program to begin with. The gap it filled was seasonal glut, not hunger, a way to use up what would otherwise rot on the vine before the next planting. The smell alone marked a household as one that gardened seriously, a warm vegetal steam that hung in the kitchen for an hour after the dish came out. Extension pamphlets ran variations of this recipe by the dozen, because it was one of the few dishes that could absorb whatever a garden actually produced instead of what a recipe demanded. Families who grew their own squash that summer ate this casserole 2 or 3 times a week without complaint. because the alternative was watching the garden's work go to waste. Number 17 is Spam and Powdered Egg Scramble, and it earns its spot because it combined the two most talked about ration foods of the entire war into a single skillet. Spam wasn't rationed, canned meat products largely dodged the point system, and powdered eggs were distributed specifically to stretch the fresh egg supply for the military overseas. The method was fast. Diced Spam browned in a skillet, then reconstituted powdered egg poured over it and scrambled until set. One pan, 10 minutes, done. A tin of Spam cost about 30 cents, and a box of powdered egg equivalent to a dozen eggs ran even less. And together, they made breakfast for a family that would otherwise have gone without eggs that week entirely. It suited working households especially. Mothers who'd taken factory jobs while husbands were overseas needed something that came together before a shift, not a leisurely Sunday breakfast. The texture was the tell. Powdered egg scrambled up drier and slightly rubbery with a faint metallic aftertaste no amount of pepper fully covered. Wartime cookbooks tried to dress it up with names like Camp Scramble, but everyone in the kitchen knew what it actually was. It's one of the most mocked dishes of the entire era now, and also one of the most honest. Cheap protein, no apologies, cooked by women who didn't have the luxury of complaining about the taste. Number 16 is Eggless Applesauce Spice Cake, built for a war that had claimed both the eggs and the sugar a normal cake needed. Applesauce did the work of both. Its moisture replaced the eggs. Its natural sweetness cut the sugar requirement nearly in half. Flour, applesauce, a little oil, or melted margarine, cinnamon, and whatever spice was in the cupboard, baking soda standing in for the leavening eggs would have provided. It baked in one pan, no separate mixing bowls for whites and yolks, no waste. A jar of home-canned applesauce cost close to nothing if the family had an apple tree, which many did. The cake filled a gap beyond ingredients. It let a household keep baking on birthdays and holidays without breaking ration rules, which mattered for morale more than nutrition. It smelled like fall no matter the season, cinnamon and cooked apple pushing through the kitchen the moment the oven door opened. Women swapped this recipe over back fences and in church bulletins, because it was one of the few wartime desserts that actually tasted like something you'd have made anyway. It quietly outlived the war. Versions of it are still floating around old church cookbooks today, usually with no explanation of why it has no eggs in it at all. Number 15 is the Oleo margarine mixing ritual, and it's less a dish than a chore every household with a butter ration performed weekly. Dairy state laws, protecting the butter industry, banned margarine from being sold pre-colored in much of the country, so it came out of the package stark white, like lard. A small dye capsule sat inside the bag, and the housewife had to knead it through the margarine by hand in a bowl until the color turned an acceptable yellow. 10 minutes of kneading, one bowl, no cooking at all. But it was a task performed in nearly every American kitchen at least once a week for years. It cost a few cents less than butter, and it didn't touch the dairy ration, which was the entire reason it existed. The gap it filled was blunt. Butter was rationed hard, and margarine wasn't. So this was how a family kept something spreadable on the table. The texture told the story before the color did. Greasy, slightly grainy under the fingers, until the dye worked all the way through. Kids in the household often got the job, squeezing the bag like a stress toy, while their mothers cooked something else on the stove. It was tedious, faintly ridiculous, and completely normal. Nobody who lived through it forgot the smell of raw margarine on their hands. Rationing wasn't just a grocery list problem. For a woman cooking alone with a husband overseas, every one of these dishes was also a way to make it through a week by herself. One point-free meal at a time. Number 14 is Meatless Tuesday loaf, and the name tells you exactly what it was for. Government messaging pushed meatless days hard during the war, echoing the same Meatless Tuesday campaigns from the First World War, all aimed at freeing up beef and pork for troops overseas. The loaf itself was built from whatever protein didn't count as rationed meat, cooked lentils or beans, breadcrumbs, a beaten egg or powdered egg substitute, onion, sometimes grated cheese, all pressed into a loaf pan and baked for about an hour. It cost pennies per serving since dried beans and stale bread were both already sitting in most pantries. The gap it filled was almost civic rather than financial, a way for a household to visibly participate in the war effort on a day the government had specifically asked them to. It suited families trying to conserve their weekly meat points for a Sunday roast, spreading 1 week's ration across more meals by skipping meat entirely on a designated day. The texture leaned dense and a little dry, without any real fat holding it together, which is exactly what made it filling on a working-class budget. Extension bulletins ran recipe contests for the best meatless loaf, treating it almost like a patriotic duty dressed up as a cooking assignment. It disappeared the moment meat rationing ended, and nobody built it out of nostalgia. It was never meant to taste good, only to hold the family together for one more day of the week. Number 13 is carrot marmalade sugar substitute spread, born out of the same math problem as the Prune whip. Sugar rationed to roughly half a pound a person per week, and a household still wanting something sweet on toast in the morning. Carrots, unrationed and often overgrown in a victory garden anyway, carried enough natural sugar to stretch a jam recipe using half or even a third of the sugar a normal batch called for. Grated carrot cooked down slow, with a small amount of sugar, lemon juice, or vinegar for acid. Sometimes a little grated orange peel if it could be found, simmered in one pot until it set up thick enough to spread. A batch made from a few cents worth of garden carrots produced enough marmalade to last a family several weeks of breakfasts, which mattered enormously when the household's entire sugar ration might otherwise vanish in 2 batches of real jam. It filled the gap of the morning routine. Toast and something sweet on it was a small daily ritual. Families didn't want to give up just because sugar had gone to the war effort. The color gave it away on the table, a burnt orange spread that looked like marmalade, but tasted distinctly of carrot underneath the citrus. Extension Service bulletins published dozens of sugar-stretching recipes like this one, treating carrots less as a vegetable and more as an ingredient for hiding sugar shortages in plain sight. It quietly vanished once sugar rationing lifted in 1947, replaced without ceremony by the real thing. Number 12 is government cheese casserole, built around a hard truth of the ration system. Cheese carried its own point value, and a family that wanted it in dinner regularly had to make it stretch as far as meat did. American cheese, distributed widely through government and commercial channels during the war, got grated thin and layered with macaroni, rice, or leftover vegetables, baked in one dish until the cheese melted through everything else instead of standing alone as a topping. A small block of cheese, maybe 4 ounces, could carry an entire casserole for a family of 4, which meant 1 week's cheese ration covered 2 or 3 dinners instead of 1 plate of cheese and crackers. The gap it filled was about disguise as much as economy, stretching a rationed ingredient by hiding it inside a starch so a little cheese tasted like a lot. It suited households juggling 2 or 3 different ration books at once, where every ingredient had to justify its points against every other ingredient competing for the same meal. The smell carried through a house fast, sharp, and slightly burnt at the edges, where the cheese crisped against the baking dish. It became one of the most repeated dinners of the war years precisely because it was forgiving. Almost any starch or vegetable on hand could go underneath the cheese, and the result still read as a real meal. Number 11 is Community Cannery Pressure Cooker Vegetables, and this one carried actual danger, not just inconvenience. Home pressure canners were made largely of aluminum, and aluminum had been classified as a war material, pulled from store shelves for the war effort. That left households with 2 choices. Can vegetables the old-fashioned open kettle way, which didn't reach a high enough temperature to reliably kill the bacteria that causes botulism in low-acid vegetables, or haul their produce to a government-run community cannery, where a shared pressure canner did the job safely. Women loaded up baskets of green beans, corn, and tomatoes from their victory gardens and carried them, sometimes for miles, to a school gymnasium or county building fitted out with commercial-grade canning equipment. A single trip could put up 20 or 30 jars at once, enough vegetables to carry a family through a winter without touching a single ration point on canned goods. The gap it filled was safety wrapped inside economy. Without access to that shared equipment, the alternative wasn't just less convenient, it was a genuine health risk. The sound of the place stuck with people. Rows of pressure canners hissing at once, jar lids popping as they sealed, women trading turns and trading gossip in the same breath. It's one of the only entries on this list where the danger was real and the workaround was communal rather than individual, which says something about what people were willing to do together when the alternative was rolling the dice with their own family's dinner. Number 10 is Liver and Onions Ration Special, and it existed because organ meats largely sat outside the point system that governed muscle cuts like steak and roast. Extension bulletins pushed liver hard during the war, framing it as a way to keep a family's iron and protein intake up without spending points that were better saved for a Sunday roast. The method stayed simple. Liver dredged in a little flour, pan-fried with sliced onions and whatever fat was on hand, 10 minutes total, 1 skillet. A pound of liver cost a fraction of a pound of steak and fed the same number of people, which made it one of the few genuinely cheap sources of real meat left once rationing hit its stride in 1943. It suited households trying to keep growing children fed on iron and protein, while stretching every other ration point toward variety elsewhere in the week. The smell announced itself before anyone reached the kitchen, a mineral, slightly sweet smell, from the onions caramelizing against the liver's edges. Plenty of children of that generation grew up hating liver specifically because it showed up so often, not because their mothers particularly loved cooking it. It was duty food, chosen for what it didn't cost rather than what it tasted like. It stayed on family tables in scattered pockets ever since, less out of nostalgia and more because some habits from necessity just never fully let go. Number 9 is wartime bread pudding from stale bread, and government leaflets during the war were explicit on this point. Stale bread was not to be thrown away, full stop. Waste of any kind carried a kind of quiet social shame during rationing, and bread was treated as sacred enough to earn its own instructional pamphlets on how to use every last piece of it. The pudding took torn stale bread soaked in reconstituted powdered milk, sweetened lightly with sugar or honey if it could be spared, bound with an egg or powdered egg substitute, baked in one dish until set and slightly crisp on top. It cost almost nothing, since the bread itself was already past its useful life for sandwiches, and it turned what would otherwise be waste into an actual dessert. The gap it filled was less about hunger and more about guilt, using up a resource completely, in a country actively being told that wasted food was disrespectful to men fighting overseas. It suited every household equally, since stale bread accumulated no matter what else was rationed that week. The texture gave it away instantly, custardy in the center where the bread had gone soft, with a firmer, slightly caramelized crust on top where the milk had baked dry. Recipes for it appeared in nearly every wartime pamphlet distributed by the USDA, treated not as a treat, but as a small act of thrift dressed up to look like one. Number 8 is green tomato mock mincemeat pie, a recipe built for a very specific gap in the fall calendar. The first frost hitting a garden full of tomatoes that hadn't ripened yet, with real mincemeat's beef and suet either rationed too tightly or too expensive to spare for a pie. Green tomatoes, chopped fine, simmered down with vinegar, a little sugar or molasses, raisins if they were on hand, and warm spices like cinnamon and clove, mimicked the tang and texture of a traditional mincemeat filling without needing a single ounce of meat. One pot did the entire job, and the filling could be canned afterward for pies made months later, stretching a single fall harvest of unripe tomatoes into pies well into winter. It cost next to nothing beyond the spices, since the green tomatoes themselves were otherwise headed for the compost pile before the frost took them. The gap it filled was seasonal salvage, turning a garden's failure to fully ripen into dessert instead of loss. The smell carried the same warm spice notes as a real mincemeat pie, which is exactly why it fooled dinner guests for decades after the war ended too. Families who grew tomatoes kept making it long after rationing lifted, not because they had to anymore, but because it had become genuinely theirs by then, no longer just a substitute. This stopped being about saving money somewhere around the middle of this list. It became about refusing to let a single tomato, a single bone, a single heel of bread go to waste on principle. Number 7 is blood sausage ration stretcher, a dish that leaned on an older immigrant tradition. German, Polish, and other Central European households had made blood sausage for generations before the war, using every part of a butchered animal because nothing else was an option. Wartime rationing simply made that older habit relevant to households that had drifted away from it. Fresh blood from a hog slaughter, mixed with grains like barley or oats, seasoned with onion and whatever spice was on hand, stuffed into casing and simmered gently, one pot, a couple of hours. It cost almost nothing beyond the labor, since the blood itself was a byproduct that would otherwise have been discarded entirely at slaughter. A single hog's worth of blood sausage could feed a family for a week or more, at a time when a pound of a normal cut of pork was competing hard against every other rationed protein in the house. The gap it filled was about extending an entire animal's usefulness past what the point system counted as meat, since organ and blood products often carried lower point costs or none at all. The texture surprised people who hadn't grown up with it, dense, slightly grainy from the grain filler, a deep mineral flavor under the spice. It mattered most to immigrant communities in mill towns and farming counties where grandmothers who remembered the old country simply taught the technique forward to daughters raising families through a second war in one lifetime. Number 6 is dried milk powder custard bake, built to stretch a resource that had gotten complicated fast, once dairy started competing with the war effort for shipping and storage space. Powdered milk was distributed widely as a shelf-stable substitute for fresh, and a family could reconstitute it into something close to regular milk for the price of a fraction of what fresh milk cost. The custard took reconstituted powdered milk, a beaten egg or powdered egg equivalent, a small amount of sugar, a pinch of nutmeg, baked slow in a water bath until just set. One dish, one pan of hot water underneath it. It cost almost nothing per serving and used ingredients that didn't spoil sitting in a pantry the way fresh milk and eggs did, which mattered for households managing unpredictable grocery runs during the war. The gap it filled was storage and shelf life as much as cost. A dessert that could be made from ingredients that survived weeks without refrigeration, in a country where refrigerators themselves were still not universal. The texture carried a faint powdery aftertaste under the nutmeg that nobody who grew up eating it ever fully forgot. It suited large families especially, since a single box of powdered milk stretched across more servings than an equivalent amount of fresh milk ever could. It quietly disappeared from most kitchens once fresh milk delivery normalized again after the war, remembered mostly by the generation that grew up drinking reconstituted milk without a choice in the matter. Number 5 is underground root cellar stew, and it existed for a reason older than the war itself. Most rural households still didn't have reliable refrigeration in the 1940s, and root cellars were how families kept vegetables through winter regardless of what was happening with ration books. Potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, whatever had been stored down in the cool dark since fall, pulled up and simmered together in one pot with a small piece of rationed meat or a soup bone stretched thin, cooked low for a couple of hours until everything softened into itself. It cost whatever the garden had already produced months earlier, since the root cellar's whole purpose was storing food. The household had grown for free rather than buying it fresh in January. The gap it filled was seasonal and logistical at once. No fresh produce available for months at a time, no dependable refrigeration, and a family still needing dinner every single night regardless. It suited farm households and rural communities most directly, where a root cellar dug into a hillside or built under a porch was as ordinary as a stove. The smell settled into a house differently than other stews, earthy and mineral, from vegetables that had spent months in dirt floor storage rather than a grocery bin. Grandmothers taught daughters which vegetables to layer at the bottom of the cellar and which needed to sit up higher where it stayed slightly warmer. A whole informal science passed down with no book behind it. Just memory in a root cellar that had to last the family until spring. Number 4 is Whale Meat Ration Stew, and this one is documented, not folklore. Whale meat was sold openly at Eureka, California's city market during the war, and the sale was photographed and run in Life magazine as proof that Americans were finding substitutes wherever beef fell short. Whale meat never touched the point rationing system at all, since it wasn't classified alongside standard livestock, which made it, briefly, one of the few genuinely unrationed sources of red meat available on the West Coast. The stew was ordinary in method. Cubed whale meat browned in a pot, root vegetables added, simmered low for a couple of hours until the meat softened, the same technique any beef stew would have used. It cost less per pound than beef in the markets that carried it, which was the entire draw for households willing to try something that unfamiliar. The gap it filled was blunt supply and demand. Coastal communities near working fish markets had access to it, when beef simply wasn't there to be had at any price point worth paying. The taste was the sticking point for most families who tried it once. A stronger, more mineral flavor than beef that many households didn't take to twice. It never became common outside a handful of coastal markets, and it disappeared from American tables almost entirely once beef rationing eased, remembered today mostly through that one Life magazine photograph and the handful of families along the Pacific coast who actually cooked it at home. By the time rationing hit its 4th year, none of this was about being embarrassed to serve whale meat or blood sausage at the table. It was dignity, a refusal to let any part of what a family had go to waste, no matter what the neighbors thought of the smell. Number 3 is ash roasted potatoes, a technique older than the ration system that came back into wide use because it solved 2 wartime problems at once. Potatoes were never rationed, and fuel and cookware both were, in a way most people don't think about now. Coal and gas for stoves were rationed or in short supply in many areas, and metal cookware itself was hard to replace once it wore out, since so much metal had gone to the war effort. Ash roasting sidestepped both problems entirely. Potatoes buried directly in the hot coals and ash of a fire already burning for heat or another meal, left to cook through in their skins over 40 minutes to an hour. No pot required at all. It cost nothing beyond the potatoes themselves, since the fire was usually already lit for warmth or another dish, making the fuel essentially free. The gap it filled was equipment and energy at once, a way to cook a full meal component without tying up a single pot or spending a single unit of rationed fuel beyond what was already burning. The smell gave it away from outside the house, a scorched earth char smell mixed with the sweet steam of potato skin splitting open. It suited rural households and anyone heating with a wood or coal fire anyway, turning an already burning fire into a second job without any extra cost. Families who grew up with it remember cracking the blackened skin open with bare, careful fingers. The inside steaming and soft, salted with whatever was on hand, eaten standing up next to the fire that cooked it. Number 2 is powdered egg omelet bake, and if any single dish earned the reputation this entire video is named for, it's this one. Powdered eggs were shipped overseas by the millions of pounds to feed troops, and the civilian population got a domestic version of the same product to stretch the fresh egg supply at home. The method looks simple enough. Powdered egg reconstituted with water, poured into a greased dish with a little chopped onion or pepper if available, baked until set. One pan, 30 minutes. It cost less than a dozen fresh eggs by a wide margin, which mattered when fresh eggs were both rationed and genuinely hard to find some weeks depending on supply chains that were, by 1943, stretched thin across an entire country at war. The gap it filled was blunt. No fresh eggs some weeks, full stop, and a family still needed something resembling breakfast. The texture was the whole problem. It baked up rubbery, slightly gray at the edges, with a sulfurous smell that no amount of onion fully masked, and everyone who ate it knew exactly what it was the moment the fork went in. It's the dish most wartime housewives complained about loudest in later interviews, the one that showed up in oral histories again and again as the food people were happiest to see disappear the day fresh eggs came back to the stores in full supply. Nobody looks back on this one fondly, and that's honestly the most accurate thing that can be said about it. Number 1 is Victory mincemeat made with beef heart and suet, and it sits at the top of this list because it captures the entire philosophy of ration-era cooking in a single dish. Nothing gets left behind. Beef heart, an organ meat that largely sidestepped the standard meat rationing points, got ground fine and simmered slow with suet, which was still relatively available since it wasn't a prime cut competing with steak and roast for ration allowance. Apples, raisins, spices, and a splash of vinegar or leftover cider rounded it into something that tasted, against all odds, close to a traditional English-style mincemeat. Simmered down in one large pot until it thickened enough to can or use immediately in a pie. It cost a fraction of what a mincemeat made with prime beef would have run, since heart and suet were both priced well, under any cut competing directly for ration points. The gap it filled was the most complete one on this entire list, using an organ most families would otherwise have discarded, alongside of fat-trimmed offcuts that had already been used elsewhere, to build a dish associated with holiday abundance out of the parts of the animal nobody else wanted. The smell filled a house for hours, warm spice and simmering fruit masking the fact that the base of the whole pot was ground organ meat. Families who made it often didn't tell guests what was actually in the pie until after they'd already eaten a slice. And by most oral history accounts, most guests couldn't tell the difference at all. It's the dish that best proves the point of this entire list, that during the war, resourcefulness wasn't a footnote to a recipe. It was the recipe. What ran these kitchens for 4 straight years wasn't money, not really. Sugar, butter, and meat were rationed, but memory, stubbornness, and a refusal to waste a single scrap weren't, and those were the ingredients that actually got dinner on the table night after night. A lot of these dishes disappeared the moment they were allowed to, and a few of them, quietly, never fully did. What's been lost isn't the recipes themselves. Most of them are still written down somewhere, in a county extension bulletin or a mother's handwriting in the margin of an old cookbook. What's been lost is the necessity that made them make sense, the specific kind of hunger and shortage that turned a beef heart or a green tomato into something worth simmering for hours. Pick one of these this week. Make it slow, the way it was made the first time, with no shortcuts and no substitutions for the substitutions. Eat it the way it was meant to be eaten, because there was nothing else, and someone made it matter anyway.